Brooklyn Day to the Dweck Center here at Brooklyn Public Library. I'm Joel Whitney from the BPL Presents team, the arts and culture curating team. It's nice to see you all. We're going to have a wonderful event tonight with Tina Chang, Nicole Counts, and Ilan Stavins. Unfortunately, Youssef couldn't make it today, so we're down a person, but it's still going to be, I've heard some samples of the conversation backstage. Before I introduce our speakers and panelists and guest of honor tonight, I just want to remind you how to stay in touch with us and tell you about some things that are coming up. Is that cool with you? All right, great. This is called The People's Tongue, this anthology that we're talking about tonight. A celebration of Restless Books' 10-year anniversary. Later in the month, these two People's events kind of bookend our month of April beautifully. We have the People's Ball, which is kind of a populist sort of anti-Met Gala, a fashion show for the rest of us. Whereas tickets for I think the Met Gala are something like 30,000, right? This one, we said what would be the opposite of that, and the answer, once again, is free. All of our events here at the main stage and all around the 62 branches in Brooklyn, including our newest, Center for Brooklyn History, are totally and completely free to all. You can stay in touch with us. Specifically, our department has a landing page at bklynlibrary.org/BPL and BPL Presents is our handle, as you can see behind me, on everything social media-wise, and add that underscore in between for Twitter. Without further ado, we are here to celebrate the People's Tongue, which tells the story of how English became American over a period of 450 years. And we have a panel of distinguished editors and poets who discuss the current state of the American publishing industry and the ways in which it changes the English language. What is the role of independent presses? In what way do new books represent the changes American culture is undergoing? Do editors understand the needs of diverse readers? And is English as alive on the written page as it is with the spoken word? Tina Chang is here, the author of 3 critically acclaimed poetry collections, Hybrida, Of Gods and Strangers, and Half-Lit Houses. She is also co-editor of the Norton Anthology, Language for a New Century, Contemporary Poetry from the Middle East, Asia, and Beyond. She was the first woman to be named Poet Laureate of Brooklyn, and she served in this role for over a decade. Professor and Director of Creative Writing at her alma mater, Binghamton University, she oversees the initiatives under the Binghamton Center for Writers. Nicole Counts, her is a senior editor at One World, an imprint of Random House, started her career in marketing and publicity at Public Affairs and Bold Type Books. She has worked on and has won or been nominated for the National Book Award, the Lambda Literary Award, the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, various Penn Literary Awards, and more. She is an active member of various publishing equity groups, as well as a longtime volunteer with Well-Read Black Girl. She was a finalist for the 2020 PW Star Watch, an active speaker on publishing book-related issues, and has been profiled in Gagosian Quarterly and Publishers Weekly. She has written for Poets and Writers, Brooklyn Magazine, Art Noir, and more. Ilan Stavins is Louis Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, the publisher of Restless Books, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. His latest book is The People's Tongue, Americans in the English Language. Please welcome our speakers today.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's a pleasure to be with both of you, Nicole and Tina, in this occasion to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Restless Books, an independent, nonprofit, Brooklyn-based publishing house that in the climate of publishing and in the economic climate, 10 years feels like an eternity. I am thrilled to be here to enthusiastically celebrate it. And in order to celebrate it, we have published this anthology that we are going to be reflecting on today, as Joel mentioned, The People's Tongue, Americans and the English Language. I am an immigrant from Mexico who came to the United States in 1985 with very limited, I would use with a very primitive English language skills. And in many ways, for me, the book is a love letter to the English language, a language even more than the country that I feel has been incredibly receptive and embracing and always willing to open itself up and to be pushed in different directions. The anthology features more than 90 different authors, starting with some of the settlers and pilgrims that arrived in 1607. Up until the very present, they are poets and activists and politicians and linguists and lexicographers and teachers and translators and just about anybody who has had something interesting to say about how the English language changes in those 450 years that Joel was mentioning. And it changes dramatically. If you read the very first entry in the book, you realize that the language spoken in the Massachusetts colony is almost illegible and not understandable to us. The syntax was erratic, the grammar was unstable, a little bit like Shakespeare before all the editors that have come in and kind of made him more plain and accessible. And if you continue, you see Sojourner Truth and James Baldwin and Julia Alvarez and Amy Tan and Isaac Bashevis Singer and so many writers, so many immigrants, and that's why we are based in Brooklyn, that have pushed the language in many different directions. I want to really thank you both for coming, and I want to say that I'm hoping that we're going to go in two different directions. One is to explore how poets and writers hold on to the language, how they shape the language, how they inherit and pass it on to the next generation. What is it that what's the writer's responsibility when it comes to fixing the language and then allowing it to become a statement of its time? At the same time, I want this other parallel topic, which is what is the role that publishing houses, that editors, that people in the publishing industry do in order to reflect the changes that the American English goes through. And particularly is the language that we speak today in America, the American English, with all its tensions, with all its beauties, with all its drawbacks being reflected on the page of the books that we are publishing? Or is the publishing industry a gatekeeper that doesn't quite allow for the transformations to be heard fully? Because Yusef is not here, and we very much feel him here, feel his spirit, I think Nicole is going to bring him in.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'll just quickly say that it's interesting hearing 450 years, because if I think about it, I'm the only one on this stage that only speaks English. I only speak one language. But also, I don't know if there was any other languages, right? Like my people were brought here 400 years ago, and so in so many ways, English is the only thing that has been in my blood. And yet, I think a lot about the language of the body and what language we hold within us. It's my favorite edit, actually, to give to all my authors is to take it to the body, to tell me how their body is feeling. Because often, I think words or the English language that we've been taught, it won't, there's something missing there. But okay, I will read, this is like the biggest honor to read this poem called English. When I was a boy, he says, the sky began burning, and someone ran knocking on our door. One night, the house became birds, and the eaves too low for a boy's ears. I heard a girl talking, but they weren't words. I knew one good thing, a girl. was somewhere in our house, speaking slow as a sailor's parrot. I glimpsed Alice in Wonderland. Her voice smelled like an orange, though I'd never peeled an orange. I knocked on the walls in a circle. The voice was almost America. My ears pluckered a word out of the air. She said, friend. I eased open the door, hidden behind overcoats in a closet. The young woman was smiling at me. She was teaching herself a language to take her far, far away, and she taught me a word each day to keep secret. But one night, I woke to other voices in the house, a commotion downstairs and a pleading. There are promises made at night that turn into stones at daybreak. From my window, I saw the stars burning in the river brighter than a big celebration. I waited for her return with my hands over my mouth. I can't say her name because it was dangerous in our house so close to the water. Was she a boy's make-believe friend or a beehive breathing inside the walls? Years later, my aunt said 2 German soldiers shot the girl one night beside the Vistula. This is how I learned your language. It was long ago. It was springtime.
Hi, my name is Tina Chang. Thank you so much for coming today. It's a beautiful spring day, so I appreciate everybody being here today. I thought maybe I'd start off with just my personal relationship to the English language. So my first language that I ever learned was Chinese. So I grew up with this language for about the first 10 years of my life, learning, of course, English in school as well. But around the age of 10, well, I should backtrack for a minute. My father passed away when I was about 2 years old. And then when I was 10 years old, my mother got remarried. She got remarried to somebody who was from Hong Kong, and he spoke the dialect of Cantonese, and she spoke the dialect of Mandarin. So since they didn't speak each other's dialects, we wound up speaking English in the household from the age of 10 until presently. So I think that my relationship to English is a very complicated one because also I had a grandmother who had come to take care of us after my father passed away, and she did not speak a word of English. So I did a lot of translating for her when I was growing up. So she loved shows like Golden Girls and All in the Family, and I would wind up translating them in Chinese to her, which is very odd. I don't know if I got all the jokes, across, but I tried. But that was kind of my life, was mostly a translator for her. I think sometimes very proud that I could do the translations, and then other times a little bit embarrassed when somebody noticed that maybe she wasn't able to accomplish the same things that they could, and there was a sort of looking down upon the fact that she had lived here for so many years and she just hadn't learned English, and why was that the case? So there were lots of questions like that. And then once English took hold in our household, my step-grandfather came to live with us, and he only spoke Cantonese and not a word of English. So we just became a household where we were struggling all the time. So working toward English, working toward Chinese was something that felt like sometimes very natural and sometimes felt like a labor to understand one another. So that is my relationship thus far. It's very complicated, and I'll talk about it in a little while, but I'll read this piece from my book called Hybrid. Another layer to it is I married somebody from Haiti, and then the relationship with culture, background, history, language itself became ever more multi-layered. So in this next piece in the piece that I'll read, I'm contemplating my son's life and how there was a lot of struggle for him to get here. Every single person sitting here in this room, you are the product of struggle. There were many people who had to survive for you to be here. And I think that's what I realized at the moment that he was born. You should know just something about the piece is that I was asked to write about a kiss. It was for an anthology called The Kiss. And the poet named Brian Turner asked a group of poets to write an essay about their very favorite kiss. And I said, well, that's just an impossible task because maybe I have lots of favorite kisses. And if you think about it, there's this sort of forgiveness kiss, there's a goodbye kiss, a hello kiss, there's a kiss like I'll never see you again. And so that's the sort of example that he gave to me. Brian Turner actually presented as an example to me his very last kiss that he gave to his wife. His wife was suffering from cancer, and they knew that they would never see each other again after that last kiss. So I thought, okay, I can't write something after I've just read something so beautiful like that. But he was very kind and very insistent, so I wrote, of course, about a kiss for my son. This is called Revolutionary Kiss. I had never created man before, so I invented my son first as a dream body. In order to create the dream body, I must first believe in the force of opposites, a terrible tension of what has existed and the struggle yet to come. And it is true that I had a notion of him for many years. For generations, my imagination traveled in search of him. It seems unlikely that a kiss would have its roots in the Haitian Revolution, but it does. Over a century ago, an uprising of hundreds of thousands of slaves freed themselves from chain and rope, from whip and guillotine, from bondage through the struggle of blood. They fought for 13 years in a revolution to stand on the shores of their own land, newly named Haiti, as free people, and they kissed the ground, however damp with the blood of their mothers, fathers, brothers, and sons. Slaves, newly liberated, whispered my son's name, his body envisioned there, beneath the rust of shackles, beside shards of slave owners' homes, rising with the smoke from burned plantations, past the pinnacle of scoured light, past the canopy of trees dripping with the uprising of future leaves, my son makes his way to me. Once there was a chain of kisses as my mother said goodbye to her brothers and sisters lined in a row. She left Taiwan for America, a shock of lace around her neck as she waved to a country of ghosts. Her history was equally as complex. She left China in 1949 when communists led by Chairman Mao took over mainland China. My mother crowded into a boat that would one day take her to the coast of Taiwan, known as the Beautiful Island, which she would one day yearn to leave. By foot, by boat, by train, by bus, by plane. It seems impossible that these two histories would combine so that one day I may find a dream body housed inside mine. All along, I wring my hands and worry. Will I know how to mother him? What language will I speak? What will my mother utter once she discovers the detour of my ancestry? Will she abandon me, turn the portraits of my ancestors toward the wall, backs directed away from my longing? When I woke, the doctor's voice was muffled and thick. My mind moved in syncopated pulses, and I pushed until all the energy drained and my body cracked open. Liquid gold rushed away. Finally, and now, he arrived, a purpled creature, violet and squirming, face crushed into an emperor's expression. Born from the urgency of immigrants, how futile all my years of worrying. I should have known that my boy would row his small boat to me regardless of the sky that shook down its lightning, and even if the ground was bruised and famished of all its fruit and even freedom, he would continue on as if a force was lulling him to bedrock. Right here, between his eyebrows, there is a swell of light. A country where I belong, no longer a stranger to my own skin, my mouth to his temple, and alarm cries Tanks roll through the tail squeaking, turning their heavy wheels. When I kiss him, history's weapons fall from my pockets. Shields cast beneath Atelia trees. I will now end my days of resistance, my lips searching the entirety of his dream face, made mortal. My lost shadows now migrating in unison. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Nicole, I want to bring you in here. You were telling me back in the green room about the way all of you in your family talk, Black English, African American parlance. Is that not a foreign language? Is that not? Do you see it as an inner turf? Does it have its own cadence? Does it make you feel secure when you use it? Tell me about it.
Yeah, first, thank you for that reading. That was beautiful. I'm still like on that shore thinking about that. So AAVE, African American Vernacular English, it's so interesting. I didn't even know that was a term until college. And a professor said something like that at the time, I believe it was Maya Angelou. He was like, oh, Dr. Angelou is writing in this. And I was like, you mean she's writing in Black people talk? Like that, I didn't know there was a term for that. And then fast forward to about a few years ago, I published a book called Finna by the poet Nate Marshall. And it's a great collection. And then part of my job as an editor is to be an advocate for the book. So I was presenting it at a positioning meeting with our sales team. And I was starting to talk about the book and what it was about, and someone was like, I'm so sorry if I'm supposed to know this, but what does the title mean? And then everyone started saying, we have no idea what finna is. And I was like, oh, you don't use that? Like, you're finna do something, you know? And it made me think, you know, it's a Southern term that came from fixing to, and so anyways, I share that story because I guess it is a language in its own, but because it's been so politicized and so looked down upon for so long, I think Black people have, or at least my understanding of it and my relationship to it is we've just really protected it. So I feel the most free when I'm with, you know, my friends and family, where I feel like I can speak however I want to speak, you know, and I'm not being judged by the way I speak. And it is really fascinating because when I'm with my family, they call me the like hippie because I like to read and wear glasses, and I'm like, I'm so far from a hippie that they probably, so it's always this interesting kind of balancing act, I call it, because I don't like the term code switching because I'm not sure if that's really what I'm doing or if I'm just allowing myself to be free in a space that I won't be judged in.
But when you speak the language that we're speaking right now, English, you are less free?
Yeah, I think I've always felt less free in American English because I've always known that I didn't have any other choice. I think there's something that's really painful and, you know, just life altering about never having a home, and so much of language grounds us. I think you were saying that in the green room, that language is something that roots you, and so never knowing whatever your primary language was, if I've only ever known English, you know, I don't know if I'll ever really feel free in it. But what I will say is that you had asked me how I started working in publishing, and when I was 13, I was in this English class, and I remember telling my teacher I hated books, and he took me out of class literally that moment, and we went to the library, and he gave me Jackie Woodson. And before that, I didn't know that there was this way that language could free us. And so it's kind of literally a daily struggle for me as an editor, because I feel like I'm constantly trying to push the bounds of language and what language can do, and also trying to find a home in something that was given to me, you know, or forced upon me.
Before I go, let me just stay for a second with you, Nicole, and I have a question for you, Tina. In the 60s and 70s, when a Chicano author or a Puerto Rican author or a Cuban American author would publish a poetry collection, almost by law, there would be a glossary at the end with all the words that the expected reader was not going to understand. And they were Spanish words or Spanglish terms. And it was felt that it was the responsibility of the publisher to encourage the author to give in to explaining. But maybe about 15 or 20 years ago, such an artifact at the end of the book became embarrassing. We don't need to explain to the author what we mean, to the reader what we mean. It is up to the reader to figure things out. In a book like the one that you described, where there is African American English or any other, do you feel as an editor that you are it's your responsibility to encourage the author to open a parenthesis or put a footnote or to create a glossary at the end where a term that is not understood by, say, 80% of the population will be explained, or should it be left alone for the reader to sink or swim?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in left alone. I don't think you should italicize it. I don't think you should call it out at all. I was just working on a book where there's a lot of Yiddish in it, and the author italicized all the Yiddish. And at this point, I'm like, Google. People can Google. It's very, very easy, you know? And there's just this way that when you look at it, like the way it looks on the page, it just separates out those words, those terms, that space, and it makes the book into an other. And I feel like that is actually exactly the work we're trying to undo, you know, is to not make it the other.
I think the argument with that too is it truly, because you mentioned 80%, is it truly 80% of an audience that wouldn't understand
Just throwing
that,
a number
or
out there.
you know, but the idea is a bigger one too, is that who are we explaining it to? I think that it was sort of is the larger idea, is that who do we need to be able to explain this to? Whose gaze are we trying to satisfy?
Who are you writing your poems to in terms of the duality, Tina, of the Mandarin and the Cantonese and the Englishes that exist on your page, or are ghosts that don't exist on the page but are like a breath?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge too, is that it's oftentimes when I'm involved in panels and I'm asked, who am I writing for, or who am I writing to? I think that the main argument that comes back is, would we be asking a white writer who they're writing for, who they're writing to? And it's almost a preference for me not to answer that question, because in doing so, I feel that, you know, I'm locking myself into this sort of the trap of the historical answer that, am I writing for Asian Americans? I mean, I'm always writing for Asian Americans. I mean, I'm always writing for people who understand the space from which I'm writing from. But if I open it up to a universal space, I almost feel like sometimes that's not accepted. You know, and if I had white skin, and if I was, you know, grew up in the classic sort of accepted American English, that I wouldn't be asked such questions. And I think that sometimes even to pose that, you know, do we need to be asking questions of somebody with, you know, my skin color or the way that I look, that question overall. But I wanted to make sure that I read your quote, because I did not get to do that. So you had written a chapter in this collection, The People's Tongue, and it's all about Spanglish, and it's fascinating.
Which I love.
Well, first of all,
Not the piece. I love Spanglish.
yes. I mean, you wrote a beautiful introduction, a historical sort of looking back on American English, and then you wrote a very beautiful piece on Spanglish, which also felt very personal, but also kind of panned out a little bit. So I really appreciate it. But in it, I hope I could see, because my vision is very bad. Let me see if I could read it. It says, from your essay, it says, What does verbal training mean? The capacity to articulate thought clearly and coherently in a standard language. Amy Tan, the Chinese-American novelist of the Joy Luck Club, once published an essay called Mother Tongue. In it, she describes the way her mother, an immigrant from China to the United States, was frequently ridiculed by native English language speakers for using a broken language. And a broken tongue connotes broken thoughts. So we were talking about this before. We had so many conversations before we came out that I wanted to make sure we didn't cover too much, but I wanted to return back to this idea of brokenness, which I think comes up so much, this idea of broken language. I didn't think in my household when I was speaking Chinese and when I was speaking English and I was going back and forth, and even the struggle of it to maybe understand even for myself in what spaces I felt it was acceptable to speak English in front of my English-speaking friends or friends who didn't have another language? Would I feel as comfortable speaking that as I did in front of my relatives? Because all of my relatives and I moved back and forth between English and Chinese. But I think somewhere, and I think this is where the language also, I hope one day it will change, where it moved from being fluid between two different languages or more, because I know many, many households that speak more than two languages, how it then moved to this place of being broken, a broken language, or because then that I think connotes like a broken identity. And I didn't feel really broken at all until I opened my door and entered into the outside world, and suddenly I was deemed to be broken or speaking something that wasn't broken, as in like it needed repair, broken as in something about it wasn't normalized or right. And then I was asking myself, who is saying that? Like, who is creating this language around my language, which is fluid, right? So I thought that was a really beautiful point. And it goes back to the Spanglish essay that you had too, that did you feel that way when
I first came, when I was growing up in Mexico, I was a member of a small Jewish enclave, and Yiddish was the language of home. Spanish was the language of the street. And I resented the fact that I had to speak two languages. Only later did I realize the advantages that come with it. And only later did I also find out that Yiddish is like Spanglish. It's two languages that came together and created a third one, a hybrid language like you are exploring, that is a little bit of German, a little bit of Hebrew, but was the language mainly of women, of children, of the illiterate, not of the Talmudic rabbis, of the great theologians. And it was considered, and I'm using this word very strategically, as a kind of bastard language, an illegitimate language. And it would take almost 1,000 years for someone to get the Nobel Prize in 1978 for writing in that language. It was a broken language. It was considered a broken language, but the term, just as in your case, Tina, is absolutely alien to me, because there are no broken languages. Mm-hmm. There are different processes by which we acquire a language. When I arrived in English, I had very little access to it, and I felt I couldn't fully express my thoughts. But I was struck, just like you, by that term that Amy Tan uses of the broken language. On the other hand, my love for Spanglish is immense. And if I publish a piece sprinkled in English, sprinkled with Spanglish, the editors will like it. If I write only in Spanglish, that is, every single sentence switches back and forth endlessly, obsessively, they will reject it and say there's no reader for it, which is not true. There are 65 million Latinos in the United States, and many of them are fluent Spanglish speakers. So in some ways, it is the question of are we the carriers of a different type, not of brokenness, but of a different approach to the language? What do you think, Nico?
I mean, a language is only broken, it's only called broken by someone who feels that they are more powerful, are stronger, are more important, superior. And I mean, I think that's always what it comes back to is fear that someone else's language, someone else's culture, someone else's et cetera, will be better than whoever, whoever is speaking. And so if I'm the one calling your language broken, that's really just me projecting my fear of being lesser than. And I think it always comes back to that. I think any kind of separating out. I think that question of, I deal with that, I feel like every day of like, well, who's the reader, It's again, I think it's such restricted thinking, And I think it actually takes more work and time to be imaginative and to think through like possibilities and to dream. And I think a lot of publishers are just lazy. And
Both work in publishing, so
yeah, everyone but us. But yeah, I really think it goes back to that.
But I want to go back to something that we were discussing, and maybe, Tina, you want to take it from here. There is obviously an issue of authority here. The outsider looking in, who's the reader, and the reader is an abstraction, or the reader is whoever we want it to be, or we don't want to answer that question. But on the other hand, there are certain structures within every language that keep the language healthy and going. And I am posing here a topic that attracts me very much. Spanish has a Real Academia Española, a Royal Academy of the Spanish language. Nobody pays attention to it, but it legislates, so to speak, how the language should be used. And every so often they publish a statement that now you can't use an accent here, or the ñ cannot be used in this way, and everybody laughs, and then maybe somebody starts going and following the pattern. The French have the Académie Française, the Germans, the Italians, but the English language, arguably the most powerful language in the world in terms of business, in terms of technology, has no academy, has no entity that safeguards the language. And at the very beginning, the founding fathers, John Adams in particular, thought this country is going to go to the dogs, I'm quoting him, if we don't have an academy that protects the language the way we have other entities. What do you think of that? What are your thoughts, Tina, on the fact that that the French have somebody who tells them you can't use le weekend because it's an Americanism, but we don't have anybody who's telling us as a nation this is the right way of using it or the wrong way of using it?
I feel that we do.
And who's that? The teachers?
Should we go there? Yes. I'll just say the former president. It's just an example, right? The former president was espousing this all the time, and then it trickles down. It's like we were talking about this idea of funnels, right? Which way does the funnel work? I don't want to really visualize it too much, but let's just say the funnel's at the top, and then that level of idea kind of trickles down. Intellectuals or publishers would like to think like, oh, we're resistant to that. We are the thinkers. We are the creators. We are the channels by which artists will be able to distribute their work. But I think that kind of impact of somebody who's really the person that's channeling that language to begin with, that has impact. So, for example, on a very basic level, my children are now in school where they are learning different languages. And we were talking about this before, where they're cycling through different languages. First, they cycle through Chinese. Then they cycle through German. Then they cycle through French. and then I think Spanish. So they have maybe 2 months with each language. My daughter had tried Chinese first for very clear reasons. She thought, okay, maybe there's something I can honor in my mother's heritage and something that I can take on. But even, so this kind of language that's maybe pushed forward by even a previous president trickles down to even children. So as she's taking the Chinese language, she walks into class very proud, very excited to learn language that she feels that somewhere maybe in her history that she should know. And then what happens? All the children in her class start making fun of the language, start teasing even the teacher and the educator about her language. And then what happens is she moves from pride to shame. Pride to shame. And then how does that work? Right? But it starts from somewhere. And so then we, so somehow we have to be the people who are always sort of fixing as a way of, I think you were talking about how is language nurtured? Are we the ones that carry it forward? Yes, we are the ones that carry it forward, and yet sometimes it feels like such a large struggle, a fight to constantly push this language forward, but not only to have it live, but to be proud of something that you're carrying this. It's a treasure. You're carrying the treasure from one ancestor to another, and you're hoping that it lands somewhere, either with your child or with publishing, something that you want to pass on to someone else to say, take this treasure, do something special to it. Don't forget it. Push it forward. And then in these little instances like this, I was having a talk with a translator and a historian who said, the translator said, America is where languages come to die. It's a graveyard. And so you can see that even in this little instance with children, right? They're planting these seeds in education to say, okay, look, you have these opportunities to learn language. And in these little insidious ways, from trickling down from like a sort of hateful language that's on a national scale, not everybody's involved in that language, but then it moves to children, and suddenly the children are sort of killing this language. And that could potentially be a possibility.
Nicole, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, there's just this James Baldwin essay in this collection, and I feel like it speaks kind of perfectly to that. It's called If Black English Isn't a Language, Tell Me What It Is. I'm only going to read a short excerpt, but it says, the argument concerning the use or the status or the reality of Black English is rooted in American history. The argument has nothing to do with language itself, but with the role of language. Language incontestably reveals the speaker. Language, also far more dubiously, is meant to define the other. And in this case, the other is refusing to be defined by a language that has never been able to recognize him. I think about that a lot, of just this, is it the language itself, or is it what, like in this trickle-down effect, what this language is supposed to be pointing to?
Talking about the former president, in this day of nuisance in New York City, the anthology includes a number of presidents, Lincoln and Clinton and Donald Trump, almost at the end, all the tweets that he ever sent to CNN. And I thought this was a perfect example of how power uses language, and I wanted to showcase the way the former president uses capitals to scream at in the language, exclamation points, not one, not two, but 15 at the end of a sentence, and how he can reduce, he thinks, everything into however many characters, 147 that they were, where every single aspect of his anger, his fury, his destructiveness could be there. When starting to send the permissions out to different authors, I came across a number of them who said, if Mr. Trump is in the book, I refuse to participate in this anthology. And as I was telling both of you, the argument that I needed to make as an editor, and I found myself in an awkward position, not defending Donald Trump, but wanting to publish Donald Trump as a statement of where the American English is today. The argument was that we need to make that room for the varieties to exist. And there were 4 that were resisting, and 3 immediately said yes, but 1 really held on in the barricades until the very end, when she finally said, "Yeah, I agree. I'll be honored to be. I'll be honored to be in the anthology, not to be next to Donald Trump, but I'll be honored." But it's because, in many ways, it seems to me that in this day and age of political ideological fracture, what we have in common, maybe, is still the language in which we can't find commonalities. And when it comes to Latinos, for instance, the language of conservative Latinos is very different to the language of liberal Latinos. Even the word Latino will not be used by a conservative Hispanic. It's a conservative Hispanic and it's a liberal Latino. The same group, maybe not the same group anymore. And the question to me is, as this kind of dismemberment of the society takes place, is English still a glue? Is it still a statement of the polyphonic nature that we have, or is language also becoming a casualty? Any thoughts before we open it to the audience? Nicole?
I guess I have one that is, this could change tomorrow, but part of what I'm thinking right now is that, Trump uses language maybe exactly how the English language was designed, which is as a violence. Like, so much of the English language is used to manipulate and to twist. And we talk a lot about conservatives or whoever twisting the language of liberals, or liberals twisting the language. And yet, I think that's its function, I think it's just very interesting to think, is the language the thing that is harming us or changing, or are we just not seeing that it's always been this weapon?
But isn't any language, Nicole, that, Spanish has been the language of empire, French has been the language of empire, German, Italian, and within Latin America, Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, was the destructive language of all the other tribal languages that existed prior 1492. The language of those that are victorious. Walter Benjamin says at one point that there's no history of civilization that is not at the same time a history of barbarism. And if we're going to account for that civilization and that barbarism in any language, it will be as a kind of violent act of destruction.
I wonder why the English language then has persisted so long with its violence,
I think that's the question is, I think for publishers and editors is it changing? And if we see it changing, in what ways? Here's some of the ways I think it's changing. And I say it with a grain of salt, because one of the questions that you had is it changing at the pace that is reflecting outward at society? The answer is absolutely no. We have all in America been existing in so many languages, and none of our publishing is at all even remotely 2% even reflecting how we're moving. So that, I think that's the exploration of the question there. But in the ways that it is changing, so for example, I just invited, I direct a program at Binghamton University. We just had an author named Javier Zamora who came and spoke about his migration from El Salvador to Guatemala to Mexico, finally to the United States as a child. in the book, he uses English and he uses Spanish, and there's no explanation for it at all. I love that. I see that happening more and more. Similarly, in Chen Chen's new collection, your please someone remind me because it's such a complicated title. Your emergency contact has experienced an emergency is his book, and it is what it sounds like. It's quirky in the most intelligent ways, so funny, so fully itself, and it also moves back and forth between English and Chinese, also with no explanation at all. And for that, I love the movement that I see language sort of taking place, taking hold. I wish it happened all the time. I wish it was more reflective of what I see and feel when I move into the streets of New York City, and I recognize that it's happening there, very different from when I move north and I'm in upstate New York. And one of the things that we mourn the most that we talk about all the time is that we don't hear other languages in our midst. And that then the fabric and the texture of our lives becomes radically reduced and feels like almost there's a grayness, there's a gray veil over our lives because we don't get to experience that on a daily basis. So in terms of publishing, I see movements, but there's at a snail's pace. You know, that's what I see. Maybe the both of you see something different.
I want to give you an opportunity, Nicole, maybe to answer that, and I also want to open it up to the audience. There's a question here. I think there's a microphone, another question there that are going to go back and forth. But Nicole, maybe you have something to say. How turtle speed publishing?
I just agree. I think I've been very fortunate where I've been able to publish things that are in like an Indo-Caribbean dialect. The entire thing, there's no like you read it, you get into it, and that's what we offer. I have published books in translation. I think that's still a huge. I still think that's like the biggest issue in American letters is that we do not publish enough here from other countries, and it is very hard to get approval. I think the biggest thing for me as an editor is I think I've seen change in the sense that there's a more diverse editorial pool. There's editors from all over the country now, but I don't see that in marketing and publicity. So still the way we're talking about books and the language we're using to sell books is still not. I don't even know if it's at a snail's pace. I think it's somewhere below.
Nicole, you were telling me in the green room how after making a copy of the back cover of a book or for the, it comes back from the marketing and salespeople, and you feel that it's not exactly, you have to, I don't know, you say it better. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I think there's just a way that you can rely on the story, what the book is actually saying, rather than the identity of the author or whatever the hook is that they think. So whether it's like a queer story or a book by a black woman, that is not telling me anything about the story. So that's not going to sell this book. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things that goes unseen is a lot of the labor that goes into rewriting pitches for people, rewriting galley letters, rewriting the copy, because there's not advocates always on those sides as well.
I want to just before we open it to the audience, mention that there's the proverbial 3%, whereas in other countries, in other languages, French, German, Italian, Spanish, the number of books published every year that come from other languages into that language can go upwards of 50%. In Germany, it's 58% of the books that are published every year that come from another language in translation. The proverbial number in English is that it's around 3%. Maybe it has gone up to 5%. In this very large, very powerful country, the amount of works that we get in translation from other countries is incredibly limited, resulting in a parochialism that is frightening. There were some, and now we can open it up to the...
Yes. Oh, hi. Should I stand up? Or? Oh, okay. Thank you for this scintillating conversation. I wanted to ask about the importance of language being wrong. Like, for example, you can imagine someone, a student, writing an essay for a high school English class and saying something like, let me ask you a question. Is there a value? I mean, you can imagine very soon a future where we're so woke that that's not wrong, that's just a different way for a person to express himself. By losing that concept of right and wrong language and grammar, are we allowing the English language itself to lose its power and clarity, almost like a freeway where the guardrails have been removed?
Do you want to take it, any of you?
I think that my first question whenever I've been in those situations, or even as an editor, my job is to question every single thing, every single word, every single punctuation mark, every single line break, and have the author explain back to me why they chose that word or why they chose, this decision. And that process is me trying to understand what they're actually trying to say and if they're using all of the tools at their disposal to do so. And so first I would ask, I'm not sure it's about, I don't know if there's ever going to be no guardrails, and I don't think it's about whether the language, like the rules of language change with wokeness or understanding of, or not understanding, of valuing other cultures or other inputs. I think it's first about trying to make sure there's space for what needs to be said. And then I think it's about working within or figuring out the ways that our system of language can actually help someone do that even more. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think we're also sometimes moving into dangerous categories when we're talking about the preservation of some level of purity of language in general. I'm always really careful around that kind of conversation because I think that we are all the contributors to this language, and I don't know who's putting the guardrails there. I'm not sure or why. I think the question is, why do the guardrails need to be there to begin with? What exactly, by placing them there, are we trying to preserve? What is it, what aspect of it that we feel that we're not permitting to change, and the reasons behind it? I mean, I guess that's sort of what I would be sort of gesturing toward.
For me, it's very simple. If it's a child, you correct it. This is the way the word is spelled, but you encourage the child to say, look, you can play with the words in many ways, as long as you understand that this is one that is the correct form, the one that we use today as correct. There is a margin of playfulness that goes in any direction. And I say this as somebody whose spelling in English was disastrous when I first arrived, but I think there's a need to know what is correct. I think in order to get to Picasso, just drawing a few silhouettes, you have to go through Rembrandt and through the classics and the romantics and understand the development of art. Freedom only exists within the acknowledgement of what came before it. So I think it's very important to have absolute freedom to destroy the language when you understand how the language works. Because if it's only from the destruction, from my viewpoint, then it's a form of irreverence and lack of continuity with the tradition. Maybe
I also think there's a fine line between, or maybe something quite vast, between what we consider to be destruction and then evolution. I don't know. I think it's pivoting in terms of the ways of thinking. I think of almost everything as evolution. If we were going to gesture toward, a contemporary book of poetry, the poet Cathy Park Hong has this wonderful book called Dance Dance Revolution, in which I guess if you were to look at it and examine it, when my students read the book, they have a very difficult time discerning in the English language how to read the book. Because in Cathy Park Hong's mind, she created a character that lives far into the future. And that character who lives far into the future speaks a kind of patois. And it's the combination and it is the crossroads of all different languages that have come together to create this one sort of universal language. So one of the things that I think that you talk about in the book is, has American English become, or maybe it's a statement, American English has become the lingua franca, has become, in essence, the universal language. If that is the case, then I think what you're saying is like, do we need to maintain that level of purity? If we feel that we must maintain that level of purity, then we don't allow all these avenues and all these influences from all different countries remain so embedded, I believe, in a dangerous idea of like the American language, the American English being the governing language around the world. And I think that the more we stay or rooted in the United States, the more we feel that way. And then when you travel out, you realize it's a world. And they're changing things, and they're utilizing English in the ways, not just Chinglish, not just Spanish, in every language they're changing up the English language. And when I hear that, because of the way that I grew up, I feel freedom. I feel, oh my God, relaxing. In the same ways that you talked about, the ways that we speak at home, very different than the ways, and I'm not talking about language. I mean, like, it's almost like taking off your clothes and putting on some sweatpants and putting on some, you finally feel that you can speak the language that you speak at home. Maybe everybody has that.
Question right here.
It's highly questionable, to say the least, that there's a standard American English, and I think you've sort of talked about, you danced around that issue, and you've addressed it. But there are also a tremendous number of great variety in American English, regionally and sub-regionally. If you look at Donald Trump, that's Queen's English. It's also the class markers in Donald Trump's speech that I think enable him to channel class rage. And I can recognize him, see him myself, having grown up in the Bronx and living in Brooklyn. And I think that there's also a certain maybe intrinsic classism in literature as well. And with regard to variation in English, I mean, there's a tremendous regional variation, as I said. And in the past, in the 20th century, there was really vigorous regional literary traditions and practices, and in the South and the Midwest and the West. And may sound a little heretical, but white people aren't monolithic. And so language and the use of language orally as well as in writing is tremendously various. There's no norm. So I guess my question is, the two related questions. One is how publishing is receptive to these regional voices. And another question, which is sort of related, does the fact that so many writers are situated in the academy, does that flatten out English? Does that prejudge, skew literature in a certain direction because it's situated in the academy? That's sort of loosely related to those questions.
You said academy, right? Yes. Yeah. Nicole, you want to take either or?
Sure. I'll just start by saying, I mean, absolutely. I think about this all the time. I mean, even the example of like, to understand the Picasso, you go through the Rembrandt. Like who is creating these markers of genius or literary? And something that I personally, one of my biggest pet peeves is a lot of the work that we consider incredibly literary or of recent years, of I'd say like the last 10 years, when you read their work, they're not actually saying anything. And I think that is, there is this like deep class divide, and it's not only a class divide, but then it comes out with, so what is the new idea that you're actually saying to me here? And so, but what's fascinating is that when you think about, not that it's all about sales, but when you think about book sales, the books that actually work are not the books that are using the highest level of language or, trying to tap into these quote unquote brand new ideas. I think it's literature that feels accessible and that feels relatable, and that you feel like you yourself as a reader can enter into it. It's something I think, at least in my publishing career, I've thought a lot about is, even the way that we talk about it, like the terminology of commercial versus literary or accessible versus not, I think there are like wink wink terms when we're saying that. Of commercial is a writer who didn't go to Harvard or didn't have the X, Y, and Z pedigree, but that's just not true.
The anthology includes, is very concerned with the topic that particularly the first topic. There's Zora Neale Hurston and Dunbar and Henry Roth and varieties of English coming from the Southwest, from the Midwest, because we are 325 million people speaking 325 different forms of English in this country. And though the publishing industry is based here, and more in Brooklyn, it is really attempting to be, by default or by force, by violence, the representative, the forum of the entire country. However, I think that the topic, I totally agree with Nicole. It is who we have as editors that can listen to the beauty of the story and how the story is developed in the different types of parlances, of lingos, of rhythms, of the music, that I think is crucial, because in the end, otherwise you homogenize everything and turn it into a kind of monolithic view of literature. And literature moves at two levels. It is what is being said, the enchanting story, and how it's being said, the beauty of the language to convey that story. And they have to work in tandem. As for the academy, I think it's terribly destructive in the way it polices language in the woke approach. I have been in the academy for 30 years, and I think that it's, in my view, creative writing programs, undergraduate programs are very often a replica of how the teacher wants to see how the language moves, seldom opening up to varieties. I might be in a minority and it might sound conservative. I am perfectly comfortable with it. My biggest fear is that the moment that American writers stop being able to sustain themselves by writing reviews and articles and ended being co-opted by the academy, we ended up having a very simplistic and repetitive type of American literature that you have to go out of that in order to really bring the beauty of it, in my view. Sure, but I was mainly talking about the type of language. I mean, if you are going to workshop a poem or a short story, in my view, you end up writing by committee. But I'm in the minority there. Tina, I don't know, you might have a very different opinion. You all are also in the academy.
I've always had a reaction to even the word academy. I can only talk about it from, say, I mean, I grew up as an independent poet. I didn't really even connect myself with many different groups, and then I found myself involved in academia. And it was really because I thought in my mind that maybe I could play a role somewhere, and then I found myself in academia and then working within these structures that was really more about bureaucracy and control of language. And the more I sort of came in as a sort of an individual poet, I just started writing out my little poems and then publishing them. And now I'm within the system. I oftentimes ask myself, who is in the academy? Who are we considering the academy? How long is this particular kind of academy going to last? Because I actually can't wait for it to phase out and for a new academy to come in, an academy that actually really welcomes me welcomes the difficulty and the complexities of who I am and everybody else who looks like me, doesn't look like me. So it's still, I'm in a state of still disbelief, confusion, and hopes that maybe someday the Academy might be a place that actually has a platform for me at some point, but it only comes in maybe in the years to come. Like, yeah.
There's time for, I don't know if there's any other question. Yes, one more. Will be the last one.
It's not so much a question as a statement. I lived for so many years, 28 years to be exact,
There's a microphone here.
in many countries. Thank you. Yes, for 28 years, I lived in many countries in Africa, 16 of them I worked. And there is where you really see diversity of language, because each of these countries has 100 and something different dialects or languages. I wouldn't even call them dialects, they're just languages. And you're standing there and you're using the language of the colonizer, French or Portuguese. But when you really want to get to know the people, you begin to acquire and to understand what they're saying in some of their languages. I mean, it's the richness. The whole reason for language is to communicate. And I think one of the things, if you don't mind my saying so, is that we forget that. We just want to be communicating, to know what the other person is saying. What are you doing? What is your, what motivates you? What's your culture? What are you cooking? How do you make this piece of art? Or so I would not be so self-conscious about what others have to say about how I use language as much as to really relate to communication. I mean, that's really the foundation of it all. In all of my travels, that's all I've seen, really. And so I think to forget that is perhaps a little bit sad.
Beautiful. I want to conclude just by reading a very short poem by Emily Dickinson that I adore. She is also from Amherst, where I live. A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Nicole. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks again to our speakers. That was really a pleasure to hear and to eavesdrop on. I also want to say there's a poem in there that you must not miss by Natalie Diaz that reminds us that our language in this land was not English. It was Lenape. And I think the poem is Lenape. Manhattan is a Lenape word. And so in this conversation, that's kind of an important reminder. If we think we're the keepers of a language of a particular place or of a particular land, we must remember that we're guest speakers of an imposed language on this land of 580 some odd tribes that we rarely hear about. So I was so glad to see that included in the anthology, and so delighted to hear you all speak about English and how we use it and how editors do or don't gatekeep. You can buy this amazing book from our friends, the booksellers at Greenlight. If you go out the left door, it'll be on sale there for you. And if you want Ilan to sign it, you can get in this line, and there's a table that you can line up in front of, and Ilan will sign it. So thanks so much again for being here, and we'll see you at some of the upcoming events.